help our services become more accessible from a multilingual access point. I also wanted to mention that I use my pronouns as she and her, she, her, hers. So I really want to encourage all of us that this is going to be like a peer learning opportunity. And also I'll be glad to share my contact info if any of you would like to follow up as well. So maybe to kind of begin this conversation, and I also appreciate all of you introducing yourself since we're such a small group. I'm hoping that all of you will feel comfortable to ask questions, share feedback, or share comments. All of us bring our whole selves when we do this work. And I know many of us, we wear a variety of different hats. I've certainly had throughout my entire personal and professional career in doing a lot of work with underserved, marginalized communities. So I'm going to just start off by sharing a little bit about how I kind of came to, when I started doing this work professionally back in 1985, starting off as an advocate at my local domestic violence shelter. First of all, I needed to just mention that there was a lot of conversation about talking about how we needed services to be accessible. I think it was just assumed. It's also that there are many mainstream programs that are out there and they all play a very important role. And I was working with a mainstream domestic violence shelter here in Sacramento right after I got out of college and such. So I happened to be working the evening shift, and this was like within my first 3 months of working at the shelter. I also happened to be the only Asian advocate on staff. We were a 30-bed shelter program, and we had about 20 staff that worked and many volunteers that worked at the shelter. But if you can imagine like a swing shift, this is like later on at the night towards the tail end of my shift, coming up after 10 p.m. And this was like within the first 3 months that I was working there. And when I was working there and being the only Asian staff person, I was really proud and still proud to have worked with this program for many, many years. What happened is we had a survivor that I was contacted by the survivor, and she also happened to be at the local medical center, and she was being treated. She was brought in by law enforcement. And what had happened is she happened to be Korean. She didn't speak any English. And so it was really clear we were going to go ahead and bring her into the shelter. And I happened to be the only person on staff. So we go out and get her, bring her into the shelter. But there was no way of communicating with her. You know, she didn't speak any English. You could tell she was really scared. She was traumatized, suffered some very significant physical injuries. We're not even talking about the trauma and the mental health aspect of all of this, but she was brought into shelter. And my main focus at that time, as I would with any survivor in that situation, is it's late at night, just get her situated, collect some minimal information. I was able to get that from the law enforcement folks, all the folks there in terms of the information that we had available at that time. So did a very minimal intake, brought her in, just wanted to get her situated, get her settled, and that will sort it out in the next morning. It was just to get her situated so she can get some rest. So what happened is the next day I go off shift, and so let's just think about this. So the next day, the staff come in and I turn over this information to the person who's relieving me at midnight as well. But, they normally figure this out during the daytime with the rest of the staff and my shelter manager and all that. So let's just think about this. Who do you think that they assigned as her caseworker or as her advocate? Based on the fact she didn't speak any English, she's Korean. I'm the only Asian advocate. Who do you think they assigned it to? Any guesses? Me, right. So Adam's pointing at me. So yeah, because what are the assumptions? Because I'm Asian. I happen to speak, I'm somewhat fluent in one Chinese dialect, just conversationally. But first of all, I'm just going to say Chinese and Korean are very, very different languages, right? And so again, this is something that happened in 1985. Do we think that kind of situation still plays out at programs around the country? Because yes. Again, we do this assumed similarity that we're figuring, well, we're going to make do with what we've got. But what happened and what's so tragic about the situation is I happen to be going off shift for the entire week. I don't come back into the office until a couple days later. And when I come back, aside from the fact they assigned her to me and probably only had minimal contact with her, but there was no conversation about do we need to think about bringing in an interpreter? Because back then, and probably even now, there's not money in the budget, right? A lot of us assume we don't have the money to pay for an interpreter, or where do we even go to go find an interpreter? But what's more important about this is that, do we prioritize that language access is really important? And what also happened is when I came back on shift 2 days later, she was gone. Because imagine what it's like being in a shelter or going into a service provider, whether it's a rape crisis center or domestic violence program, but seeking help and you can't communicate with anyone. Imagine how isolating it feels. Imagine, aside from all the trauma, the physical injuries, all the stuff that a survivor is dealing with, but imagine not being able to communicate and coming into a strange environment that you're seeking shelter from. One, shelter is hard enough as it is to go enter a shelter. That I always come in with this mindset, no matter how we make the conditions as inviting, supportive, and welcoming, it's still hard to be in a strange place. And it's also incredibly hard for a survivor, and if they're bringing their children or any family members with them, that it's very hard and it's very isolating. The other thing that's really important, and out of this situation really started my self-reflection process, and really was the impetus for me to talk about, and specifically in my community, about there's got to be a better way. We have to be able to create better services than this. And even within my organization, talking about, why couldn't we provide an interpreter? And why did you folks assign her to me? Because I can't communicate with her. Chinese and Korean are vastly different. Yes, we all come from our origins of our family and all that. Families come from the same continent, but it's very vastly different. And that's a disservice to her. So, and not even factoring in about language access was probably the primary reason why she left shelter. And so at that point, it really started me to have these conversations with my other colleagues or API colleagues in my community. And that really started a lot of the conversation about we needed to create our own shelter for our own community. And so, it caused a lot of us to pause and this is one out of many stories where we knew that a lot of people from the Asian Pacific Islander communities, which make up about 20% of our population here in Sacramento, to really think about how to do services in a different way and in a better way. So aside from that, but just getting back to the piece about talking about, we need to know who's in our community when we start these conversations about access. What are the different languages that are spoken or reflected in the communities that we serve? And also, what is our commitment, not only from a personal level, but from our organizational or programs that we work with? What is our commitment to ensure access? And what does access need to look like? So some of the genesis for this type of conversation is really thinking about, what's our commitment? What are we willing to commit for in terms of resources? And secondarily, do we have the trust and the relationships with these communities? That relationships are really key, that we have to start engaging and partnering with these communities. So when I tie this back into the conversations about my sister's house, even though we knew we had a commitment to try to create services for the Asian Pacific Islander community, we knew we need to have their support, because we know that there's a lot of stigma attached to talking about gender-based violence or domestic violence or sexual assault, that quite often in many culturally specific communities, these are not common terms that we can have conversations about. And also sometimes in some of these languages, these terms like sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, even child abuse, there aren't comparable terms in many of these languages. That I know and I'm going to speak a lot about the Asian Pacific Islander community, but I also don't want to generalize that. It's probably, if it typically holds true in many other cultures as well, but I don't want to speak for all of them, that there aren't comparable terms. Quite often they have to paraphrase or kind of use an analogy to describe that there aren't specific language terms in many of these languages to talk about sexual assault or sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, any of these terms to really talk about it specifically in these communities. And that quite often there's a lot of stigma and taboo attached with it, and that it's uncomfortable, just as we would find in probably many parts of America, that it's not comfortable to talk about these issues, that it's not part of the mainstream. We hear more about it in the news, but do we really talk about it within our families or in the context of our friends and families? So what are some of your thoughts about this? Does this seem to hold true, or do you have some thoughts? You're welcome to type them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and contribute. Or any questions?
I believe that it should be diverse. And I know I've been a SAPR VA for 6 years. And majority of the SAPR VAs that I see are Hispanic or white. And so it should really be diverse, because
Agreed.
Not necessarily that a Black person would want to talk to another Black person, or a white person want to talk to a white person. But if it is the case, that should be available.
I wholeheartedly agree, Katrina. I think it's really important that quite often we also have to think about within our field or within our pool of our group of advocates, it also makes a difference if we have more diversity and that we're inclusive in this process. And quite often, how we start off in terms of having language access is also having folks from representing different communities and having that language ability. And I think you bring up an excellent point that it makes it more accessible in that regard. But I also think you brought up a really important point too, that sometimes there are folks from within, like if we see survivors that may come from a specific community, whether they're Latino, Asian, or or Pacific Islander, or from any of these respective communities, sometimes there are some survivors that may have a level of distrust of getting help from an advocate that is from their same community. And let me kind of pose this question. Why do we think that might be an issue? What are some of your thoughts about that? Why would it be hard sometimes for a survivor to seek help from somebody that may come from their own community?
May fear community backlash. That happens with all cultures, I believe.
Yes, definitely. I think that plays a factor into it. Some other thoughts?
I think maybe when you're dealing with something of that nature, you feel more comfortable speaking to somebody who's outside of your community because you find a little bit more information, maybe more comfort.
Right. So I think you're all bringing up key points. I think Adam is just typing in the chat that his wife is Japanese, and this holds true with the language and assumption that all Asians understand each other. I would also like to agree there aren't words that translated to English and vice versa. Yes. So I think you're all touching on some key points. One, and it's not saying that this holds true for every survivor, but it's just being mindful and thoughtful of the fact that it may seem counterintuitive, but quite often because there's so much negative stigma and taboo, especially when we talk about sexual violence, domestic violence, that quite often we find that for many survivors, because those are the taboos that are out there, that it's hard enough to talk about these issues or to let anybody know outside of their own community or their own family, letting them know that this problem exists, that this has happened this has happened to the survivor, that they may be afraid of sharing that. And to share that with anybody outside of their own community, it's like what I think Carolyn may have mentioned, that it could create this level of backlash. You could be further isolated. And secondarily, they don't know, because there's this general cultural taboo out there. They don't know if that advocate that is from their community shares that taboo, that they're worried they're going to be judged, just like we would find for any survivor. They're fearful that somebody's going to judge them. The other thing that happens is they're also worried that their information is now going to be known throughout the entire community. And I'm going to speak from the Asian Pacific Islander community. Quite often, and since I've been involved in doing this work, and also had been managed several programs that are culturally specific, culturally responsive programs to the Asian Pacific Islander community, specifically in the child abuse field for over 10 years. The challenge was for many of my staff and such that even if we were working with one family in a neighboring town and we were doing a home visit with another family back in Sacramento, what would happen, like say it was in the Hmong community, people, and not that we were sharing any of that information, their network is so strong, everybody knew about it. Like by the time we were leaving from doing a home visit in the morning or 2 home visits and visiting 2 other families in the afternoon, those families in the completely on another town knew about our visit earlier in a neighboring community. Not by our own disclosure or anybody on our staff sharing any of that, but that community network is very, very tight. So that's the concern. And quite often when I do a lot of training with API advocates or specific with the API program here locally, I also make it very clear that we have to be very cautious and very thoughtful about even when we acknowledge people in the community, like if we're shopping in the same markets and such, people know that we're advocates and we're affiliated with this program. And sometimes they think if we're saying hello to someone, oh, that's somebody that got services from my sister's house. So partly just being thoughtful because we live and breathe in these communities and people know who we are. And so it's just being mindful and thoughtful that sometimes when we see survivors reacting and responding in this way, it's not to say that we don't need to provide services, but just understand this might be a barrier and that it's important that we need to address it and acknowledge it. And also have that conversation with the survivor. Who are you most comfortable getting help from? And what are the concerns that they have? And recognize this may not be the one-time conversation, but we may have to visit that from time to time. And again, all it is trying to ensure it's one, being responsive, acknowledging the cultural aspects of this, of the dynamics and the concerns that could come up for survivors, and being responsive. Because what we want to make sure is that they get the support that they need. And that the support that we offer doesn't have to look the same. It's an opportunity for us to think about that we sometimes have to pivot and think about different ways of what's going to be most meaningful to help provide healing and support for this survivor. And that not everybody's the same. And that also has to be reflective of our organizational commitments, not just our own commitments as staff, but how do we look at it systemically? So any questions or any thoughts about this? And I know I'm just jumping into a lot of different things at this time.
Carolyn, you had unmuted yourself earlier. I don't know if you still want to share your same thought that you were having.
About community backlash? Yeah, so not only, like Ellen was saying, not only is it fear from the community of the stigma and the taboos, but also if the trafficker is in the same community or that network. That was my only additional thought on top of that. And I do agree with the translation. I have a Chinese son. He's not really mine, but we had an exchange student, and he and his mom and I are very, very close. And Ellen, I completely agree. There are a lot of things that don't translate, and we use WeChat. And what's interesting to me is that it's innocuous for me to use it. That's how we talk to each other when Jing came to visit. But Ziwei still had to translate for us. But it's my understanding that in the Asian Pacific Islander community, WeChat is sometimes used to traffic girls and women, and maybe boys too. But that made me very sad to hear that, because such a useful tool is being, manipulated and to manipulate people for trafficking. So I was very sad to hear that.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Carolyn. And again, I think it's complicated. There's a lot and there's always going to be ongoing learning of things that we discover and learn. And so, and especially I think you bring up a great point about some of the platforms. Quite often I've heard a lot of programs that are saying, well, and there's good and bad. There's pros and cons with everything. So, a lot of programs still rely on using the AT&T language line. And so, yes, that is a tool that can be used to help provide translation, but there are limitations. I think you bring up an excellent point, Carolyn. And also there's some programs like to use Google Translate. I have really mixed feelings about using some of these platforms. I agree sometimes out of necessity, if that's the only thing available, it's better than nothing. But I go back to the premise of like, what do survivors deserve? Do they need something that's kind of a piecemeal process for us to find translation or to be able to provide that language access? Or can we do better? And can we strive for better? So maybe in this one instance, we're using electronic platform or software app to do that, but recognize there are limitations. And sometimes the translation services, the translations that they may have may not be wholly accurate. And again, going back to the premise that not all these terms translate very easily. And even for us as advocates, we use a lot of lingo sometimes in our own terminology within our communities. And quite often, especially these various software apps may not be able to translate that appropriately and accurately. So, and also quite often, if we're able to engage and begin building our own pool of advocates from folks from within these communities, that can be helpful. But that's also going to take some time to also make sure that folks have the opportunity to be able to learn and be able to provide the appropriate interpretations and translations of the various terminology that we use within our communities. And also how to break it down into some basic terms. Because again, sometimes we use this advocate speak, and even if we do this in English, it may not be a right fit for survivors. You know, think about terms that we use: victim-centered, survivor-centered, trauma-informed. Some of those terms may not resonate with survivors. It's helpful for us to communicate with each other, but it may not be the right fit. And so sometimes we need to break it down and break it back into basics. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments?
I see Karen placed in the chat that she does talking circles in her community, and she has confidentiality agreements that must be signed. If I hear any feedback, I will no longer allow those people to attend. And then Kelly says, sometimes we may seek outsiders' clarity of perspective.
Agreed. Excellent points. So just to touch on what Karen's saying, I think she brings up an excellent point that when we also talk about confidentiality, and I think we probably have that in terms of having those conversations from a legal perspective. And I think, of course, all organizations do that. We also need to make sure that it's translated or it's communicated in an accessible language that is meaningful for survivors. The other part I really encourage folks to think about is not only the legal definition of confidentiality, but also breaking it down for survivors, and especially if we're working with interpreters or translating this in other languages, is also breaking it down clearly that we're not going to share this information with anybody from your own community without your express or written consent. Does that make sense for folks? I do that all the time when I work with folks that are either from within the Asian Pacific Islander community or even from other communities of color, that I make it very expressly clear that that's usually within the first 5 minutes of our conversation, that I'll talk about confidentiality as a whole, the legal definition, but I also break it down and saying, as I'm talking with you and as I'm also working with this interpreter, we are not sharing any of this information with anybody within the community or even within your family without your consent. And sometimes that helps to also break down those barriers, because that's usually a fear for many survivors, and especially goes back to the point that if, as I'm an advocate that's from the Asian Pacific Islander community, if I come across a survivor from the API community, that may be a barrier because they're worried that I'm going to share this with other people and that I'm from this community, because they don't know if I'm safe to talk to. So, and especially, or even if I'm an outsider from the community, it's just important, because again, if we come from small communities and people are worried that I run into you at the store or I see you at the school, picking up your kid, they don't know who's going to know about their business. So it's really protecting their privacy, protecting their confidential information. And again, I know you may have limitations, like specifically within your own organizations about there are certain circumstances where you cannot hold that privacy. And again, you need to express that as well. But by and large, if you're not going to be sharing this information with their neighbors or their community members, I think that probably will hold true in 100% of the time. But again, just be thoughtful about how you need to navigate within the systems that you work in.
And I'd like to add on to that, Ellen, just also thinking about utilizing family members or friends who have come
Yes.
with that person as a translator, that sometimes that's not the best thing to do either.
Definitely. Yes.
Because you don't know the relationship of that person, or, you know, to the abused or to the abuser. And so utilizing someone who is like really close in that circle is just not really an option either.
Definitely. I think we have to be very careful, very cautious. Although we know it happens, I'm not a big, I would certainly discourage it if at all possible, because again, we can't preserve the confidentiality. They're not going to be, even if they say they're going to be bound by it, they may not, because again, it's the dynamics of within their own family that we don't know about. We don't know the history about that. They may say they're supportive of the survivor, but we don't know what level of coercion that can happen from extended family members. The other part that happens very frequently, which in a lot of the trainings I've done with service providers, child welfare agencies and such, the common thing that still happens in some communities is where we utilize children, regardless of their age, as translators or interpreters. And that is such a setup for failure on so many levels. The other part, it puts a lot of burden on that young person, regardless of their age. One, they may not have the language capacity. Again, terms are hard to translate. Quite often you see family members, I've seen survivors where they rely on their children, you know, as teens or as young as 10 or 8 years old to do translation in healthcare situations and all that. And it's incredibly hard. And also creates some very challenging dynamics for this person. So if anything goes wrong, who's going to get blamed? Not only the survivor, but that child. So really, it's really an opportunity for us to begin thinking about this work, or especially within our organizations, how to do this in a better way. And yes, it creates an additional resource issue where organizations need to begin to think about how to commit some financial resources to have that. Not only build your advocate pool, but to really either begin hiring bilingual staff to really look at that. How do we build that capacity and really place value on that? Or to start creating a line item in their budget to begin budgeting for interpreters and building those partnerships and making that investment. So it's really beginning to have those conversations within our organizations about how do we do that. We can take a multi-pronged approach that you're going to start recruit advocates and also building those partnerships. I know I touched on that earlier, but first of all, the first step that we need to think about are what are the different languages and communities that we want to make sure that we're serving? Like, who in our community is not being served? And that may not speak English. And what languages do they represent? That we need to think about identifying that. And maybe it's not to say we have to think about all of them at once, but begin to prioritize. I think some of you spoke about, like, we have a large Latino community or Latinx community, and we want to build capacity for that. So you identify that. The other part you need to think about the Latinx community is, are there some regional or language differences? There's a big difference between, especially I know that there's some fellow Californians here. We are probably talking about the majority of the Latino community or Latinx community represented here in California is primarily from Mexico. But that doesn't represent everybody. There are other parts of Central America, South America, Puerto Ricans. Their languages, their Spanish is somewhat different. There are nuances with that. So are we finding the right Spanish language folks, or do we have the representation of the different Spanish language dialects that could be spoken? I'm Chinese. There are more than 30 Chinese dialects that exist. I happen to speak Cantonese, but there are also sub-village dialects out of the Guangzhou region that are represented as well, and that are represented here in my community. I can understand some aspects of it, but I can't speak it. And also, that's not the service. If I can get 20% of the conversation, that's not helpful to a survivor. Mm-hmm. That only gets us maybe 20% there. But that's not the best way for us to provide services for a survivor that may speak Sayup, which is a different Cantonese dialect, a sub-dialect. So it's like, how do we do this in a better way? And also that written translations doesn't necessarily resonate because, again, it's slightly nuanced. There's traditional Chinese and there's simplified Chinese. So, and also Chinese people from Vietnam speak a slightly different dialect than people from China or Singapore and such. So again, one example out of many that exist when we talk about different communities. So it's really kind of thinking about how do we want to approach this? And also, how can we build, it's not only about having the language access, but how do we build that level of access and welcoming environment so that folks from these communities will seek help? And quite often I hear from programs that are saying, well, we have a small Somalian population, but it's really, really small in our community. I don't think they're going to even seek services. But then the opportunity for us to have the question, well, why? And are we saying because it's so small, if they have survivors, not a big deal if we don't serve them? And of course, they're going to say, no, that's not the case. So it's like, okay, then let's talk about how do we provide meaningful access? It's also about us being prepared. When that survivor comes or starts coming to ask a question or ask for help, are we going to be available?
Right.
Okay, so I know there's some questions coming in the chat. So
yes, Laura has a question.
Sure, please.
Awesome. So before I see, because I'm not colorblind and I'm not saying this to be offensive, I can see color. I'm Dominican, I'm Spanish. I grew up in New York. I work in California. I've traveled, thank God, to many places in different countries around the world. But as a Spanish speaker, one thing I know is no matter what Latin country I go to, if you know the roots and the proper language, you can communicate with anyone. So I feel like intentions, right? Like, how do you mean it? Like, if I try to help someone, they can be Mexican, Colombian, and they can use different dialogue in their country. But if I speak a proper Spanish, no matter who I'm communicating in the Hispanic or Latin community, I 100% can understand everything they're saying. And my intentions at the end of the day, it's not to prove anything by wherever they are or if they speak a certain way, is to be like have an open heart and listening to what they're saying. And obviously I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. I would just be the liaison to information they probably need. But like, we live in a society and in a world where I feel like everything is becoming a little bit more complicated. And I feel like the simple things in life is like caring for one another, sharing information, educating one another. I feel like sometimes when things get too structured, it becomes robotic. If you hire these certain people with certain personality to have certain to add certain features, it sounds to me sometimes it's like too structured. If I'm a victim myself, and to be quite honest, during the time I was a victim, I would have loved any culture. It didn't matter to me as long as they can communicate with me and tell me they were there for me. I think as a victim, that's how I look at it. I look at it like, do you care? Can you help me? And of course, language and everything else plays a role, but my fear moving forward is like that it becomes so structured like everything else, that then you're fearful to talk or react and do certain things, because you have to always think about, I mean, obviously you do have to think and be courteous of that person, but yeah, you get what I mean? It's like, I'm saying, like, I don't know, like, I just, when I'm with someone, I care. I want them to understand I care, that I'm not a robot, and I'm not,
yeah,
yes.
go ahead, please finish.
Yeah,
Sorry.
just that, like, I'm not a robot. I'm even though I am following rules and laws in place, that I'm there to listen, that I am there for them. And no matter what my skin color or my ethnicity or wherever I come from cannot change that, because I care. And I think that my intention is to just appreciate them.
Laura, I really appreciate what you said. And I think, again, if I really appreciate the fact that you're really talking about the heart of what every advocate does in terms of that you, ideally, if we have every advocate out there that came in with that intention, that heart, I think we could solve a lot of problems. And I also hear what your concerns are, that we don't want to come too structured. And I agree, I'm not trying to complicate structure or such. But what I am trying to say is that there are many programs that exist out there where they are not meeting the needs of survivors. That even though we have a lot of advocates that have great intention and have great heart, but if we can't get to the fundamental access point of dedicating some resources to be responsive, or to bring in advocates like you, me, many of us here, to be able to represent different communities, we can do a far much better job if we have a diverse advocate pool. And we also have diverse staff. But there are many programs that exist out there that don't have that. And nor are they wanting to make that happen. So I think it's really important that we bring voices to the table and we start encouraging and also advocating for that level of change, because that's really important for survivors. And also, I think every culturally specific program that's out there is important, is equally important. Quite a lot of the work that I do is that I work with a lot of funding administrators on a day-to-day basis that are trying to roll out funding, a huge amount of funding, but also providing services for Native American tribal communities across the country. And that for many of those advocates, they get just maybe 20% the amount of funding that other programs get. And they're serving a large, vast community. And so those needs are not being met for Native American survivors on many, many levels. And again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but that's something that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, about how can we balance services and make sure that it's truly accessible for every community. So I applaud you in the fact that we all have to come in that heart and intention, and we need more advocates like you out there. And I also agree that sometimes, like with the root language of Spanish, that makes a difference for survivors. But I also want to maybe ask the question that sometimes, what if the survivor isn't connecting? Then how do we approach that in a different way? That sometimes, even with our best, because I've done that many times, like I can speak enough of Chinese, there's some commonalities with roots, and I'm coming in there with all these great intentions, but I also know that it's not fully connecting with the survivor. So partly I'm recognizing the fact that my 20% knowledge of that particular dialect in Chinese isn't enough here. And so for me personally, and again, I'm not speaking to anybody else, that I know something's missing and that we could do something in a better way, and that I need to bring in somebody else that can help us with that language barrier.
Truly, I don't know. I really don't know much of Chinese, but I can speak about Spanish because I went to school in Dominican. I mean, my first language is Spanish, right? So as a Spanish speaker, I can say that I feel 100% confident no matter what part of the world that's Spanish speaking language that I can understand. And I get what you're saying. Like if I go to Dominican Republic, I talk Dominicanized to Dominicans. If I go to Colombia, I would talk some of the way they speak. So I get what you mean. Like some people do feel connected by their culture and dialogue, because Hispanic are very heavy when it comes to culture. Right. But I do believe one thing: we're all humans, and if we speak the language, even if we're not speaking it the way they speak it in their where they're from in specific, but if you care, if you show that intention of care, and they understand everything you're saying, I mean, for me, that would be enough, in my opinion.
It seems like it's enough, but the same way you say that you don't have any knowledge of Chinese, if you had a Chinese person come in and they don't have any English, how are you communicating to them the services that you provide, how you care? How can you communicate to them beyond just your body language? Because they don't have any knowledge of Spanish, they don't have any knowledge of English. We have to find a way that not just people who can speak these English and Spanish languages and the majority languages in this country, and we can't have the expectation that they will speak these languages in this country,
I
right? We
agree.
have to make
I
it
agree with you.
accessible to everyone. We have to make sure that these concepts about sexual violence, the services that we provide, are accessible to everyone. And when we say that, that's what we mean. We mean that even a Spanish speaking advocate will still be able to service someone from Darfur, right? It's not just about connecting them with maybe a person who seems to be or speaks kind of the root language. It's going to be connecting these barriers from people who don't speak that language at all, but still making sure that that community gets served. Here in this triad area of North Carolina, we have a large Palestinian presence, right? Who here speaks Palestinian fluently? Who here speaks the root of Palestinian? Not really anyone, but we still have to be connected into that community. And we can't assume that just saying that we're here and we want to be here for you translates to them, especially in the moment of a crisis and trying to understand how to get them help, right? Because there is a cultural thing with that whole community. There's a cultural piece that you have to be cognizant of, that they don't want to necessarily talk about anyone, and that sometimes in some cultures, domestic violence is not really a big deal, right? So how do I get that person help? Also, my first language is English. So how can we make our services accessible to all those folks who slip by in the margins of the margins? That's mainly what we're trying to say and to get at. Just that there are going to be some overlap with languages, and then completely no language at all, right? If they plop you down, they say, Laura, we love you as an advocate. We know exactly where you can go, right? Like we have a real big need for Laura's advocacy in this community, and they plop you down into a Chinese community. Laura's probably going to need some help in order to translate some of the things that Laura has to give them, right? Because it's not just about me being here for you. I also have some shelter if you need it. I also have some food resources. Do you need food? How do you say that in Chinese, right? How do you get that from them, that they might have additional needs in their languages? And we want to, like, I know as an advocate, I wanted to learn every language because I hated that. I hated that barrier of feeling like I couldn't communicate with the person in front of me. I had someone in front of me from Egypt, and I was just like, crap, now I need to know, like, I was just so confused, right? And then there are, like I said, the other thing that I got confronted with is trying to translate the concepts, to know that sexual violence is bad. If I had someone who was to me, they were a kid, but where they come from, they had married, right? They had married, and of course they were having sexual relations because they were a married couple. But in my culture, that's not right to have sex with a 14-year-old, but you were married. So how can I translate to this people that just this is what I offer? You know what I mean? Like, I can't tell you that what you're doing is wrong, because in your culture, it may not be. But here are the services that I offer. And if you would like to take advantage of them, here they are. And I see, Kelly, you have your hand up. Hand up, Kelly.
Yeah, please, Kelly.
I was just going to kind of piggyback on the conversation. To put it into perspective, I guess, military community is pretty small, especially when you're in a unit. You might all speak the same language, but sometimes, say here over in New Bern, I live in New Bern, North Carolina, heavy military community, by the way, and we have a large Burmese population here. The Burmese population is very homogenous. They all know each other. So if they need advocacy services, somebody outside of that population needs to speak their language and understand their nuances, or they are not going to seek services. We had a few years ago here, somebody had a very big mental health issue, and it led to a murder, it led to a homicide, and the police were struggling to find somebody outside of that community that spoke the language, because there was a sexual assault that happened along with the murder, and nobody could get services because nobody wanted to talk to anybody within inside that tiny community. So it goes back to what we were talking about initially. It's outsiders' clarity of perspective. You know, you're not going to get honest information when you're in a community that small, and the person is not going to feel like they're going to get proper advocacy services if somebody from that community, you know, like Ellen said, is translating, because you don't know what their ties are to the people that you're talking about. They could be part of the perpetration and mistranslating on purpose and giving false information to make you look, you know, to discredit you. But it's really important that even though you do speak a base language, there are nuances with every single culture that you can't possibly know unless you were brought up within that culture. And I think that's the whole point that Ellen has been trying to make, is that you may even speak the language at a proficient level, but those nuances they're culturally ingrained. And so to understand it and to translate it in a way that benefits the survivor in front of you is really, really important. So having these services of people, especially from different regions, is extremely important.
Right. I think, again, we help to build a better community, and we're better at our work as advocates if we're able to help one have diversity within our pool, to have the ability to have the language that we're all speaking and coming from some common goals and common perspective and common understanding of what we mean by terminology and such. We're also, as advocates, we're also helping people navigate systems, to navigate whether a survivor, you know, just trying to seek help and seek support for healing and recovering from the trauma, or if we're trying to help the survivor navigate, you know, the military system in terms of the criminal justice response, or even the criminal justice system. Again, our goal is to really help people navigate the systems that they also want to seek help from, like however they want to seek the resources, help. Quite often, even when we're talking about survivors, and this is especially becoming very clear as we've all been experiencing the pandemic, that quite often for many survivors, for many of these communities, are just trying to get basic needs met. They can't even begin to address the violence that they've experienced until they are dealing with housing, making sure it's sustained. If we're talking with an immigrant survivor, it may have to deal with their immigration status. It's all those pieces. Like, we can't get to the next, begin addressing the different needs until we address what are their priorities right now. And quite often for survivors, a lot of the survivors I dealt with is mainly about some of the immigration status. Things have been kind of on hold given the course of the pandemic. They're worried about it, especially if the abuser or the perpetrator has all their immigration documentation. That makes it really hard, or they have children in common, and they're just trying to make sure their children's needs are being met. That quite often we can't begin to even talk about some of these issues until we're addressing some of their basic needs about food, basic survival, all of that stuff. that those are common things. And especially if we're looking to try to serve communities that we haven't served before within our organizations, we need to ensure we have that capacity to begin addressing those needs. And that we're really committed to building relationships with these communities. Because that's also how I think Kelly, Laura, many of you touched upon, we have to have trust from these communities. And once we build that, we have to maintain it. So I kind of go back to a fundamental question when we talk about relationships. So maybe think about it for yourself. When you've engaged in a friendship, a long-term relationship with somebody that's different from you, what do you expect out of that relationship? And what do you think that person expects out of the relationship? Like how, even when you start that relationship, how do we begin to build it? Because if you don't know each other or know anything about each other, what do we need to begin to build that a long-term friendship or connection? Is it something that happens overnight?
No.
No, it
You have
doesn't.
to ask questions and be transparent. Like you can't go into a relationship, a friendship, or anything without honestly like with expectations. There's no if there's no blueprint, if there's no historical context, we all have our own history and our backgrounds. So it's just simple questions like, you know, what are we doing? Like the W's. Truly, like they sound very little, like they sound like, no, not really. But like even when I meet an acquaintance or someone I don't know, for me it's important to know where they're coming from, what do they want out of my friendship, if they even want a friendship with me. Those are simple questions, and sometimes people are scared for the answers, but it's better to have a clear, transparent answer than to expect something that it's not real.
I think you're hitting on some key points. It's like, it's one, learning about the other person, being willing and coming in with a level of transparency, honesty, being genuine, and having integrity, right?
Naming what it is you want out of the relationship. I heard that as well.
Right. And being invested.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing it's not going to happen overnight. That trust takes time to build. But we have to be genuine. We have to be invested. And we've got to be willing to learn, especially if we're engaging in a relationship with somebody who's very different from us. As I would say, that would probably be the case as we're trying to build access to these communities. So it's kind of along the lines of, it's not a speed dating relationship, right? Not that I'm, saying every relationship's like that, but it's like, you can't build a solid foundation for a relationship overnight or within an X period of time. It takes that investment. And it's not only just accessing that person or connecting with that person only when you need them, right? Like typically that doesn't work. It's not like we just show up when it's important to us. That we need to be willing to invest and build, take those steps. Every step has to be taken, but taking those small steps to build that connection. And that builds that trust. That trust is a key to a foundation for any successful relationship. That it takes time, and that the other person may not trust you for a while. Right? It's not only about our intent and our perspectives, but it's also being mindful that they may have a different perspective. And that's okay, because all of us have our own lenses as we enter into relationships. We bring our own cultural lens. We bring in our own biases, just as the other party would. But we have to recognize that there's a different perspective, and it takes time to learn that perspective. I use the example, like quite often when I do a lot of cultural competency, cultural responsiveness training, that I talk a lot about that we all bring our cultural lenses. And I happen to have a 12-year-old daughter who is now a preteen, and that's really hard for me to accept that sometimes. But she's a great kid on many, many levels. But let's use the example, like she has her own lens, but we've been, I've been the one of helping her. She and her father and I have been working very closely, and with my family, we're all very close, but she's really been shaped by all those experiences. But the thing is, like, let's say, for example, if my daughter and I are in a car accident, I happen to be the one driving. She's 12, she's sitting in the backseat. We both experience the same thing. Are we both likely to have the same perspective of the accident? we're both have experienced trauma. The trauma for her may be very different than it would be for me, right? But we just experienced the same incident. But again, we can have two totally different perspectives of that. So that's important for us to think about with survivors. And especially the trauma that they experience is far much worse than what I'm talking about in a car accident. And so it's not every situation of sexual violence, domestic violence is the same. And how they come in with that lens, and also for every survivor, their experiences may not be the same because we all bring our own lenses to that. And so it's just being thoughtful and mindful of the fact that we have to respect that perspective. And also how we engage in relationships. It's going to have different perspectives. So just being thoughtful about how we need to be committed in building those relationships with the community. It's not just it's going to probably help you in bringing in advocates from that community or folks that may want to become a part of your program and get trained. It may also help you in bringing in interpreters if you wanted to create a pool of interpreters to do that. There are different options, but that helps you to make that bridge. But it's important to have that connection and relationship with that community, because that's going to give you entree. Like I think Erica, you were using I think it was Erica talking about the Burmese community, that it's important. It's going to take a while to build those relationships. And it's going to take time. Like right now I'm involved as on a volunteer level with my local program that is working with the Asian Pacific Islander community. We are looking at trying to build this shelter for the Muslim community. It's taken us 5 years to create that process, but we're now in the process of getting ready to hire for folks. But it started with us having volunteers. But now we're at a place where we have resources to be able to begin hiring and staffing a shelter for the Muslim community. And that's huge for the Muslim community. But it took us a while to get the support of the Muslim community too. So it's not something that happens overnight. It takes step by step. Any thoughts or questions right now?
We had a question from Rebecca. Rebecca asked, would you recommend that we, quote, advertise languages that we know if anywhere our services are?
I think that, so it's a chicken and egg conversation. One is it's helpful to advertise, but if you advertise, you also need to build that relationship with that community. And you also need to be ready and have the capacity to serve. I'm not saying it has to be 100% perfect, but you have to have the commitment and be able to have the resources. If that makes sense. Yeah.
I see she made a comment that when it comes to those relationships, you definitely need to have something or a few things in common to relate to. And Karen says, as an advocate, no one comes to you already trusting. That trust has to be built.
Right. And I agree with all those things. And I think even if you're just starting off, sometimes it's about being present at their community events.
I was just about to say that. I was just about to add on, just even going to their community events, if they're having something in the community, a little get together, a fair, yep. Go, let them see your face.
And it's going back to, I think Laura talked about, it's like learning about them, just not to say that you're doing it off their backs, but being there, listening. Mm-hmm. Don't do a lot of talking. It's an opportunity to listen, hear from them what their needs are, hear from them what they need from you.
So I have something to share. So I go to Dominican Republic very often, and there's times when I'm with my friends and family, and my culture, men, they lead. You know, it's a culture ruled by men, and it's okay for your uncle to touch you. It's okay if your grandfather touches you inappropriately. It's not seen wrong in the community. It's very perversive. It's wrong. If you're an American, you go there, you're taught right from wrong in a different way, in a different angle. And when you're from Dominican Republic, the way you see things is it's okay. Those are my superiors. I'm not, they're not doing anything wrong. Honestly, if I wasn't raised in America, I would have not known right from wrong the way I do now, because the way I was raised over there was totally different from the things I was told here. So when I go back and I see discrepancies, or my family, the females tell me, I mean, the males don't really have this problem over there. It's mostly the females, and they'll say things to me, and I'm like, well, that's not wrong. That's not right. And let me explain why. And I do it with an approach of love. Like, look, you're amazing. That person is amazing. I understand that probably he doesn't understand what he's doing. So you need to say no to those things because you're uncomfortable, and that's okay. And I'll send articles because, you know, most of them are very educated. It's the culture. And I'm talking about people who are doctors and attorney and on the island, and they just are okay with this treatment because all their life they were told that that's okay. And it has nothing to do with their education level. It's just something that's not spoken about over there. And truly, like, I understand what you guys are saying. It really does make a difference when you take it in your hands to go and show your face, because some of these people, even though they know they feel uncomfortable and it's wrong, they will still take it because it's what they are told. And their allegiance is to their family and their country and their culture more than it is to you who's trying to help them.
Right. No, I appreciate you sharing that, Laura. And I think, again, it's an opportunity that we also need folks or advocates from within these communities to do that. But if we're the outsider coming in, it's an opportunity for us. It takes time to build those relationships. It takes time to do that. But it's also an opportunity that, like, I think it's a great example of, Laura, that we start getting advocates or getting folks that are willing to become a part of this work, a part of our movement to make change. So that some of that change has to come from within communities. And some of that also has to come from being connected with organizations like ours to be able to help provide those resources, provide that help, and also to help show alternatives that even though it may be embedded on some cultural norms where they think it's acceptable or it's okay within specific communities for violence to occur, this is where we begin to impact change. It's also helpful when we also have males from with, again, very male dominated communities, that we need allies. We need males doing this work to be able to have those conversations. Again, a lot of my examples are from the Asian Pacific Islander community. Again, many of the cultures or the cultural communities within the API community are very male dominated, but that's where many of the men doing this work, especially men on our board and all that, have taken leadership roles to really step up and talk about how it's not okay, that it's okay they're a part of this group and they're wanting to say no to the violence, and that we can help our community in a better way. We can help our communities thrive and get the support and the resources that they need. So again, I really appreciate the feedback. I know we have like only about 10 minutes left. Karen, I see that your hand's up. Feel free to chime in.
I want to speak in lines behind Laura. I've been here in North Carolina now for going on 2 years, maybe a little over 2 years. I'm bicultural. I'm Puerto Rican and I'm Native American. So being here in North Carolina, a lot of the women have suffered for a long time. And it's taken me this time, I'd say a good 2 years, to just put myself out there. And yes, going to the churches and going to funerals and going to wakes and doing all of these community things in order for them to see who I am and in order for them to gain my trust. So now that I am doing the talking circles and putting myself out there and sharing everything with them, they seem to be approaching me a lot more, which it's
That's
just
huge.
part of how things are. So for Laura, stay focused, stay firm, and continue to do what you're doing, because it's going to make a difference. It really is. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Karen. And again, I can't echo that enough. Thank you, Laura, and thank you everybody for all the hard work, the heart that you bring to this work. And again, we need more folks like you. So thank you. Any other thoughts or comments?
I have one quick question. So say that you don't have your services established yet. What do you recommend people to do to avoid using the digital translators? Do you recommend contacting a university nearby or like searching maybe community groups or something that have those language abilities?
Yeah, I think, again, you need to think about some of the interpreter pools. I think what's also important, the first step, is evaluate, how do you do any translation or interpretation right now? And if so, what are those practices? I think a couple of things that we touched on that were really important to not do is, one, utilize family members. Because that creates it creates such boundary issues, and it could be very detrimental for all the reasons that we're talked about. I think the other thing that can happen is also interpreter bias can happen, or sometimes there's other external influences that are occurring. Like if it's a family member, that quite often, even though I may have a supportive family member that truly wants to help the survivor, but if they come from a community or family members that are tied with the offender, saying, no, 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 we don't do this. We're not going to seek help outside. Whatever you could be translating or asking them to interpret is being told very, very differently. So first of all, think about what practices may not be healthy. And also, I'm going to give my contact information. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'm sure there's also folks at NC CASA that can help you as well to evaluate your existing policies. The other part of it is also begin looking at resources that can provide reliable translation and interpretation skills for the languages that you don't currently offer or have access to within your organization. So like the local university, sometimes the medical center may have that, and begin having the conversation about what a partnership would look like. And also, are they willing to share the same perspectives? Like, you also may want to ensure that they don't have a level of bias, or that they understand the dynamics of sexual assault or domestic violence, whatever, or trafficking, that they share the same philosophical principles that you have in terms of what you need to have happen from a service delivery perspective. And ultimately start building relationships from within these communities. It's going to take small steps, but start building them. Figure out what events they're having. Figure out if there are certain meetings that you can participate in. Are there local faith communities or churches or such where many of these folks seek help or seek services from? And just start making a presence and starting to build that. Like, it takes baby steps to do that, to build that trust. So that's really, really important. I also listed a resource of the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on gender-based violence. The thing that they do for all communities, not just Asian Pacific Islander communities, is they really promote this multilingual access model and helping programs develop that. Canon Han is their lead staff person on that. They do wonderful trainings. They won't charge you for it. They're funded by their national technical assistance provider, but they've been doing this for a lot of communities and helping them to create a framework on a multilingual access model and how to build that. And really talking about accessibility from a language perspective and cultural perspective that's meaningful. So they're a great resource. I'm going to also type in my email address as well, that you can reach out to me. And Erica, if it's possible, I may share some materials with you following this call that you can send out to folks, just some basics about interpretation in terms of some guidance or guidelines, because I used to do a lot of training in that regard. But again, it's a process. But I appreciate all of you if, just starting to think about what that commitment looks like and it's not something we can just throw together, but it really is talking about meaningful engagement. So any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Let me also just share with you one of my experiences many, many years ago in terms of one of the things you want to avoid or just a cautionary tale about how interpretation by family members can be problematic. Partly years ago, I was, as I mentioned before, I used to run a program working with the Asian Pacific Islander community on child abuse and juvenile delinquency issues many, many years ago here in my community. And partly, as I mentioned to you, sometimes we deal with all kinds of questions that come up within families. And so I was working with this family that had a teenage child. Again, the parents only spoke, they were Vietnamese, they only spoke Vietnamese and all that. And they had I've been working with this family for more than a year. And what was interesting is their child was now in middle school and had been doing really, really well in school. And all of a sudden, the parents noticed there were some behavioral issues and all that. I was dealing with them on some other issues, but the mom and dad were talking to me and saying, you know, we're really worried. We think there's all this stuff going on with our son, and we just don't know. But we know he's doing well in school. And I said, and partly they relied on their son to do all the translation for them in terms of his report cards, any correspondence from the school. Not uncommon, happens in families that are limited English speaking. I grew up in a household where my parents spoke limited English and such. So I said, okay, well, show me his report card. Can you go get it? And so they give me the report card and I look at it and there's a bunch of F's on there. And I just said, there's some problems with this report card. Are you at all concerned? And they said, no. You know why? Art. And then I said, do you know what these letters mean? And they go, yeah, they're all F's. And I go, do you know what they mean? And they said, well, our son told us that F meant fine. So that happens. So, and, you know, I give their son a lot of credit, and I was trying hard not to laugh after I had a chance to meet with their son, who I worked with for many, many years. But I was like going, that happens, right? And that's what happens when you don't understand the language, because you rely on whoever is going to tell you that. And I also understand the son's position. He didn't want to get in trouble. But he probably wasn't truthful in this moment. Although he did say fine is what he thought it was. And so, but anyway, I just share with you, that's a true story. That happens. And that's part of the reason why I really discourage the use of family members, and especially children, as interpreters. Not only in this instance, but this is something where there could be a greater level of harm that can be created out of that. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it back over to Erica. I want to thank you all for your time. I hope this was helpful. And again, expect some additional resources.
Yes. And thank you, Ellen, so much for sharing your just wealth of knowledge. And just this short amount of time, I'm sure we could just go on talking about this issue because there's so much to be learned. And I just want to thank you all for being here, for participating. I want to thank you all if you've followed us through this entire series. You've gotten so much information, and what we're going to follow this up with is you're going to get a really good package of all types of stuff that we've covered, a lot of the resources that were mentioned in previous webinars, and all of the information that Ellen would like to share. So you'll be getting that. I can't give you a date just yet. I'm going to check all the webinars and make sure we give everybody time to send in all the things that they wanted to send in for you all, so that you all have those resources to guide you in your work moving forward. Also, you are to receive a certificate for the end of this presentation and this series. You can reach out to Alexandra. I don't have the evaluation link as of right now, and because I'm recording, I can't minimize my screen to get it for you all. But I have put into the chat Alexandra's email for you all to reach out to her. Like I said, she will be back on tomorrow. So if you send it today, she can send you that information on tomorrow. And you can complete the evaluation and receive your certificates. I thank you all for participating, and I am looking forward to what you have to put on your evaluations. I want to say a special shout out to my fellow military folks. I am a Navy veteran, so I thank you all for your service. I thank you all for everything that you do every day. I really, really, really appreciate it. I love you all from the bottom of my heart. I am very, very thankful that you are in my space and sharing that right now. So I really, really appreciate you all for being here. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Yardlin from Safe Alliance, Kelly, our NC CASA wonderful intern, Carolyn from Cleveland, for crying out loud, and Miriam from Interact of Wake County, Camilla and Karen, thank you all for being here. Thank you guys. And we will be reaching out to you all to make sure that you get all the resources at a later time. So thank you. Katrina, I didn't know you were in Cleveland too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Kelly.